Okay. Uh, Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to our ongoing Adorno and Communism translation series. Um, so today we're going to be discussing what I think is an extremely fascinating text, very fun text, Contra Paulum. And we have James Crane back with us from the first session to guide us, translator of this text. The first time in English. Yeah, so James, do you want to sort of introduce the text for us, and then we'll open it up to a group discussion.
Mhm. So, hello everybody. First of all, I just discovered, I realized this earlier today, it came to me, that the Contra Paulum is supposed to be a play on Origen's Contra Celsum, the title. And I don't know much more, what to read into that beyond the fact that Adorno is making a reference to Origin there. Um, but it is interesting. I know that they were engaged in like the history of theological debates in the Christian church because of some of the work they did together for drafts for Horkheimer's Society and Reason lecture series, which would later become Eclipse of Reason. What's most interesting about this text, Contra Paulum, might be when Adorno starts and finishes it within the span of, I think, only 1 or 2 months in early 1944, as they're preparing the final manuscript for the first version or textual variant of Dialectic of Enlightenment, the philosophical fragments that would be put out in May 1944 for Pollock's birthday, his 50th birthday. So this is contemporaneous with, finishing off the first draft of that book. And the piece that we discussed in the first session, the 1946, on the relationship between critical intellectuals and the Communist Party and the proletariat, etc. I forget the title. It's very, very long. But on the relation, that one is around the time they're finishing up the last additions that they're going to make to the last version of the text, which will be published then in 1947 as Dialectic of Enlightenment. Which is just to say that, these ideas are there the entire time throughout the final stages of the revision of that book. And I think that for that reason, a text like uh, Contra Paulum, which is probably the most explicit defense that I'm familiar with that either of them gives of effectively the revolutionary and vanguard or avant-garde party. It's very interesting that they considered this Contra Paulum to be an extension of or an application of, exemplification of the shared standpoint that they developed in their collaboration to that point, that was behind the production of the philosophical fragments or Dialectic of Enlightenment. So, turning to the text itself, there is in the Google Drive folder that I shared. I think for those of you who joined, you may not be able to see it, so I can share it again, is the PDF for Tillich's short piece, which is Man and Society and Religious Socialism from 1943 that Adorno is responding to. And as I was saying shortly before we started recording, it's not entirely clear why this piece in particular set Adorno off in this way, because it seems both fairly innocuous and like a repetition of talking points that Tillich would advance like fairly often, as long as they'd known him, going back to like the late 1920s, early 1930s. I've actually found there's a few like discussions protocol in the archive where Tillich would bring over Mannheim, and Tillich and Mannheim would just like debate Adorno and Horkheimer for hours. And this is like right after Horkheimer is named head of the Institute. It's way before Adorno is an official member. And they're already fighting side by side against both Mannheim and Tillich, which again is kind of, it prefigures a lot of their later dynamic. So Contra Paulum seems to have been conceived in discussions around Dialectic of Enlightenment, the first variant in the winter of 1943, 1944. So I'm not going to read over because you'll find these available in the introduction to the text, the letter exchanges, but it is worth noting that this is incomplete as a draft and that Adorno explicitly stopped working on it so as not to give the impression that it was complete. So it remained unfinished and it remained unsent. The reason that it remained unsent was probably for a very, the most mundane kind of strategic reason, which is that it was pretty brutal to Tillich, and he was an important professional contact for them. And they were not exactly doing well professionally in 1943, early 44. They had a pretty rough go of it for most of the 1940s, actually. So they were very dependent on him for, especially, I think, lecturing jobs through Columbia. So that's probably the reason, if I had to guess, why it was not sent, especially since Horkheimer was preparing for the Society and Reason lecture series in early 1944 that Tillich had been instrumental in helping secure. So anyway, it was not sent, probably because Adorno goes a little bit too hard, but Horkheimer agrees. He is enthusiastic about it. He was actually a very enthusiastic guy, despite his reputation for being fairly dour. And he was especially enthusiastic about this. He said it was effectively ready to be sent off and published, which is kind of a crazy thing because it's so polemical. And he's usually more careful about that kind of stuff. Like when he had Lewenthal make up "dog ate my homework" excuses to account for why the essay Authoritarian State, which he co-authored with Adorno in 1940, was omitted from a version of the Benjamin Memorial issue the ISR published when they sent it to someone who they didn't think would be super down with all the communism stuff. That essay is, as one of the published pieces, probably the most explicit they ever get about their very strange mixture, as we saw in the 46 fragment on the relation, and is on display here, of an idea of revolution as tied up with the concept of socialization, which I think is often overlooked. It is actively engaging in debates in the sort of two-phase theory that Marx, for instance, will champion in the Gotha critique. It's also a strange mixture of, on the one hand, sort of a negative conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and then a more positive vision of the Council Republic or the Soviet Republic. So that in 1940, published in 42, Authoritarian State, that's going to be another one of these sort of the most explicit political texts that they would write during the 1940s. And I have to be honest, before encountering Contra Paulum, before encountering the 46 on the relation between critical intellectuals in the party, etc., I did not think that they were as explicitly and as defiantly going to maintain that position from authoritarian state throughout dialectic of enlightenment. So anyway, back to the text itself. There are a few things in Adorno's comments on the incomplete draft that are interesting. So there's one where he's going to say, regarding the section on utopia, this should be on page 12 of the PDF, a theoretical supplement is needed in opposition to the unmediated identification of the rational society with the kingdom of God, one of the most dangerous manipulations. This is something he thinks he's going to see in Tillich's piece. He said, perhaps more could be added to the critique of the before and after mode of thinking to guard against misunderstandings, since, as Adorno will note, he and Horkheimer also regularly make use of a version of the before and after mode of thinking. Although he says here, of course, means something entirely different in this context. But the before and after mode of thinking, as he's referring to it here, has to do with, the problem of, I think in the context of the essay itself, is we cannot say that before the revolution, something is impossible or possible, but after, everything changes. And I think this comes up in the context of a discussion of ontology, where they're going to refuse the possibility that ontology is something that you could do after the revolution, even if you couldn't do it before. So then he's going to say that the conclusion is missing from the piece. Adorno does not tackle the final section of Tillich's essay, although many of the themes are going to be addressed in the previous three sections of Adorno's that correspond roughly to the content of Tillich's published speech. All right, so in the context of 1940s and 30s critical theory, this isn't the first criticism of Tillich, and it wouldn't be the last that members of the group made in the 1940s. Partially because of their very close professional relationship with Tillich, even in exile. Tillich also, was instrumental for getting the ISR secured as, part of Frankfurt University in the first place, and especially getting Horkheimer appointed to the position of its director in the early 30s. That means that his line was very familiar to them. Leuenthal at one point sends a draft of a critique of Tillich's position in 42 to Horkheimer, and he says, I'm going to include references, he says, to like lines in the draft that Tillich shopped around before one of what Leuenthal called the religious festivals, where Pollock would meet up with the economists Adolf Loos and Paul Tillich in New York, and they would sort of debate religious socialism throughout the early 40s while Pollock was still in New York. And Leuenthal's like, I don't even need to send you his draft. You know everything he's going to say already. So it was very familiar to them. And that's part of the reason then that I think Adorno is able to sort of like unload so much at once, and also track, as he'll bring up, with the notions of like the tragic and the catastrophe, or the exaggeratedness of Tillich's use of the kairos concept. He'll be able to contrast that with Tillich's previous position, which he also criticized vehemently. So yeah, this is like a piece of a debate that goes back at the very least to the early 1930s, when Tillich, for instance, was director for Adorno's thesis on Kierkegaard. So what's interesting, though, is that Tillich was also one of the first critics of dialectic of enlightenment, specifically of the style. He has a fight with Horkheimer in 42 about this. Adorno also helped co-author the essay that's been translated as The End of Reason, from the German Reason and Self-Preservation, published in the 42 Benjamin Memorial. And the attack then on the essay that Tillich sends is exactly the one that Adorno is going to be responding to here, as if he senses in some moments when the Marxist position is being criticized that it is his and Horkheimer's, specifically because of the way that End of Reason ends, which is with an appeal to Marx's distinction between human prehistory and the beginning of human history, which is going to be one of the defining features of his and Horkheimer's work from those early periods. Tillich's going after this. It's not an accident that this is right after Tillich reads and responds so negatively to that in End of Reason in 42, and then fights with Horkheimer about it. So that's a little bit more of the context. Tillich is going to be an important foil for Adorno and Horkheimer for the rest of the decade. Tillich's going to continue to invite Horkheimer to give lectures, I'm fairly certain, at Columbia, where Horkheimer is just going to dunk on Tillich the entire time. There's also, Tillich was in 47. Horkheimer writes him a letter basically asking, oh, by the way, there must be theological debates in the history of Christian theology about like Jesus saying, I am the truth. So could you like put together some notes on that for us? Because Adorno and I are tackling truth as the core for Dialectic of Enlightenment Part 2. And Tillich does, to his credit, try to, mock up like a little letter with a little abbreviated history of those kinds of debates. So, but yeah, they clearly kept talking to him throughout the 40s. And I think that they were probably concerned that this manuscript maybe would have undermined that, even if he still would have been, professional with them in other respects. So in terms of structure and content, again, as I said, it's incomplete. And Adorno wants to insist on this. because it's supposed to feel like it's missing a conclusion. And that would be, to give Adorno and Horkheimer sort of the impetus to finish it off themselves. As Adorno says, a few far-reaching, breathtaking pages that he and Horkheimer never get around to writing. But it's divided up into three parts, again, that roughly correspond to the three first numbered sections of Tillich's piece. And it's supposed to be severe, as Adorno is going to open his own piece and say, because they think that this is necessary given the bluntness and the directness of Tillich's proposals there. So I think that's about it, except for some problems that I want to flag before we jump into a discussion of the text itself. And they have to do with the status of the party and the Revolutionary Party. So it seems like here, as in other places, particularly in the draft materials for and the final essay, Authoritarian State, they seem to be suspicious in the idea of a revolutionary mass party as such. They understand that a revolutionary party, they seem to understand that it's a vanguard or avant-garde party. This is something that Adorno will repeat in his letters in the 30s, the letters where he's, complaining about anarchistic psychoanalysts like Reich and Fromm, who dismiss the possibility of any rational or legitimate authority. And so they object to Freudian psychoanalysis on those grounds. And there, Adorno is going to say, for instance, this would make Lenin's conception of the avant-garde and Lenin's conception of the revolution impossible. So what's important for them is that, the party here, the Revolutionary Party, is going to look more like a vanguard party in a certain sense, and it is going to look like yeah. I do have to say, I think that unfortunately they're not super fair to Fromm, although I'm not a huge fan of his essay, whatever it is, on the feeling of psychoanalysis from 37, whichever one is the one that they really, really complain about. But yeah, so I just wanted to say then that they're skeptical of the idea. They're skeptical of the idea that a mass party can be a revolutionary party. Whenever they think about sort of restarting the revolutionary impetus in existing socialist states, they'll mention Russia several times in that context in 46, and then again earlier in 40/42. It's going to be both a revitalization of a vanguard party and the revolutionizing of the masses. So it is for mass emancipation, but it's also for the emancipation of the masses from the form of the mass, which they think is itself something that is historically produced. So they're interested in a form of sociality that is not identifiable with the mass, that's not identifiable with the collective. They'll explicitly counterpose genuine universal solidarity to collective, the figure of the collective or collectivity here and elsewhere in their works from around this point. So again, it's a very strange conception, I think, of the Revolutionary Party. What is clear, though, is that they conceive of the vanguard or the avant-garde party as a self-abolishing particular, which for that reason, because it doesn't pretend to be a representative of universal interest, can actually have already achieved universality. It can be, in some sense, like a representative of universality. And that's what, Adorno, for instance, is going to open Contra Paulum discussing. But to put it in more, positive language, it's a self-abolishing particular. As I've said, the concept of revolution that they're going to invoke in a lot of these texts from the 30s, the late 30s into the early 40s, is going to have to do with the concept of socialization. They're going to be actively engaged in rethinking what they see as both, what's necessary and unfortunate about the two-phase theory of, the transition to communism. And then again, the concept of revolution that we're going to get, which is the final thing I want to propose, is revolution is going to involve something like the negative function of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which does include, and I think that this is important to mention, it does include the repression of reaction by arms. This is something that Horkheimer is going to be explicit about in letters to Adolf Lowe, one of the other figures from those religious festivals in New York. It's very funny that it's this mixture of social democrats and religious socialists who they talk to, who get them to show their fangs and claws more readily than anyone else they're going to interact with in exile. Um, so it's Adolf Lowe, though, and Horkheimer's going to say in the same, like several paragraphs where he's going to say negative function basically of the dictatorship of the proletariat, especially in repressing reaction, then all power to the Soviets, universal participation in the administration and, reproduction of social life. He's going to say, yeah, there's going to be some coercion involved in that naturally. Um, so revolution is going to involve, yeah, the negative dictatorship of the proletariat, the negative moment, and then the more positive moment, which is the all power to the Soviets. And this is kind of going to be the model that they're going to use throughout the late 1940s, as far as I understand it. So I just wanted to offer those provocations there, which is, again, the opposition between vanguard party and mass party, the idea of the vanguard or the avant-garde as the self-abolishing particular that freely, professes itself to be such, and the relationship between particularity and universality there, tying the concept of revolution to the concept of socialization, and specifically what it looks like, their rethinking of the two-phase doctrine or theory, socialism and then communism. And then those two sides of the concept of revolution in their work from this time. Negative dictatorship of the proletariat, and then all power to the Soviets. So with that, I want to hand it over because this text is definitely spicy enough, I feel like, for people to pick up on plenty. And I barely scratched the surface in the comments that I just made. So yeah, I'm excited to hear what y'all think.
Excellent. Yes. So yes, very, very spicy text. I hope that we can do justice to all the various controversies that it suggests. Okay, so like last time, like the last two times, this will be both kind of a group discussion um, and a Q&A. So feel free either to direct questions to James or to raise a sort of point for general group consideration or discussion. Um, and yeah, try as much as you can to not pose questions in the chat, but to speak in the Zoom room. And if you really are feeling generous to show camera. Um, okay. Cool. I see a hand from Zachary.
Thanks, Crane. Great translation and great introduction. I apologize for not having my camera on. I'm dealing with a toddler here. But anyway, I was just thinking about the relationship between what Crane said and what we were talking about last time. So, this theme that's important in Adorno's work, it's central to his aesthetic theory, for example, that, generality or universality can only be expressed in extreme particularity given the falsity of the whole or whatever. So I was thinking about that in relationship to this question of sorry, you're gonna have to let me ramble through this too. So I was thinking about that in relationship to the question of basically we're talking about, for those who weren't here, the problem, let's say, of the negativity of transcendence, which is something Jake was puzzling over in his piece. Um, so obviously, there's a lot here to chew on with respect to that, and I guess for me, maybe the crux of it is comes in the first response, where there's like a pretty direct answer to like Peter Gordon, let's say. Those of you who don't know, Peter Gordon has makes a claim about the positive moment in Adorno's Consummate Negativity, where he says, that like the critique of right life it presumes a positive, the critique of wrong life presumes a positive concept of right life, let's say, and there's something like that here. The analogous terms are dehumanization and doctrine of man. So Tillich says something like the critique of dehumanization presumes a positive doctrine of man. And Adorno says like a few really remarkable things. First, he's like, according to dialectics, dehumanization precedes the concept of a human being, right? But the principal point he makes is that to assume a pre-given positive, he says, is to defy the world. um, that that a universal has never existed. A positive universal has never existed. Um, so every claim to universality is false. It's ideology in the service of repression. That takes us back to the whole beginning with the party stuff. That every claim to universality is ideology in the service of repression. Uh, so question, yeah, I don't know. I guess that's more of a here's some stuff response than a question. But anyway, just the problem that we were talking about last time was on my mind, and it seems like there's a lot of things here to think through that, and also Jake's let's say provocation that maybe it's time to get over anti-totality politics. Um, um, yeah, so there's things here I think to get into that too.
So I didn't see any other hands. So I would just say, yeah, it is kind of incredible how much of this is about the question of philosophical anthropology, because Adorno won't let Tillich have it either way, where he says, on the one hand, you dismiss the project of philosophical anthropology outright, I think in the discussion of Nietzsche. And then he's also going to say, but you also have a dogmatic philosophical anthropology in the definition of the human being as finite freedom. Which is, I think, it is interesting that a lot of even like the conceptual heart of this piece seems to be a fight there. Exactly, I think, like you were saying, Zach, in that section, the incredible section where he was like, no, dehumanization comes first. And it's through like the critical reflection on and the mediation of the problem of dehumanization that humanity starts to appear. This is also related, I think, essentially to the question of prehistory. And what does it mean to have like the prehistory of humanity and then like the beginning of human history, to follow Marx's distinction, where later in the 1940s, and this is probably more adding to the problem than it is answering anything about it, but it's where Adorno is going to say something to the effect of, and I can pull up, Adorno is going to say something to the effect of, prehistory is a particularization of the universal understood as a kind of perennial repression in the dialectic of forces and relations of production inside of what Adorno will then call a negative invariance. So particularization would not be a subsumptive logical relation, Adorno says, but concerns the structure of history itself. And so I think it's interesting there that in the same way, what does it mean to say that dehumanization comes first is the same thing as saying prehistory comes first and we're not in history yet. Where, the human history proper, when that begins, would also in part be human history proper, not just because the human being who was in their prehistory is now in their history as a stage, but that is when humanity would become real and realized for the first time. So again, I don't think this solves the problem. I think it just adds to it. But I thought that it was interesting that he'll use similar language here in those moments of dehumanization before the realization of humanity. When talking about later that same decade, the distinction between prehistory of humanity and the history of the human species.
Yeah, maybe to build on your reference to this negative invariance, um, and also, yeah, to Zachary's larger point here about the sort of that this on the one hand appears like oh, this is saying the same, this is saying basically the same kind of claims about generality versus particularity that one would find, say, in negative dialectics. And yet here it seems very distinctly tied to the affirmation of the party form. Um, and that's how the piece is introduced. And so I think in a way this text gets to like a central question of this series, or like is one of the prime examples of what might motivate reading these texts in the context of understanding Adorno's theory. Because obviously there is a kind of tradition of saying, in reception of the Frankfurt School, that yes, there might be these instances where they say these Marxist things, um, even sometimes these crazy Leninist things, but that's basically like not important, to the account, and really we can sort of put them in our pocket as a different kind of philosophical proposition, and they don't necessarily entail or require the Marxist things, let alone these affirmations of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the sort of like sequence of socialism and communism in the Gothic critique. But I think what's interesting here is that I feel like, to me, this helps clarify like what kind of intervention even something later like negative dialectics is, where now it might seem like negative dialectics is some kind of epistemological problem, ontological problem. It's a kind of philosophical claim, but I think here, like you're saying, James, it follows from the sense of a kind of what we went over last time a bit with Jake, this idea of a kind of negative system, that the systematic character of thought is a product of the systematic character of social relations in a particular shape, and that for Adorno, that systematic character of social relations would be what others would call the condition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. That this is a kind of built into the system character, the negative system character of social relations at a given stage, yields the necessity of the party and of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a kind of historical condition. And yeah, so I guess I wanted to, really draw us to how Adorno would not really treat the party question as like an instance of this more general proposition of this generality versus particularity revision of the science of logic or something, but he'll like throughout this piece cite one as evidence for the other, and then like he'll say like, well, this political proposition goes against Hegel, but then he'll also say in certain places like for instance the finite infinite question around page 35, where Tillich wants to say that there's a kind of perpetual, because humanity is both finite in its activity but infinite in its sort of aspirations, conceptualizations of its activity, etc. You're in a kind of constant tragic condition or whatever. And Adorno will say, won't contest this on like a kind of like philosophical postulate ground, like something like you begin like what is the necessary conditions of thought thinking itself or something, and like the science of logic. He'll instead be like, well, where are you going to get politically out of that? Like you're not going to get to the dictatorship of the proletariat. You can't ground the dictatorship of the proletariat in a thought like that. And that seems to be enough for him to say, which is, I think this text helps us really take seriously the extent to which those two things are co-imbricated rather than one being subordinated to the other in Adorno's thought. But maybe if no one has something else, I'd like to ask James a question. Well, We can also answer James's question. I can hold my fire for later. James asks, what do people think about this in connection with dialectic of enlightenment?
And then the other question I would have is, because I think it's interesting, the figure of, like the Revolutionary Party as a vanguard or avant-garde party comes up, and the, relationship between this and, maybe Adorno's work on artistic avant-gardes.
This was actually going to be my question to ask you to elaborate on what you understand to be the mass party that is standing in opposition here. Because um, because they of course cite Luxemburg and Lenin, who themselves were in, say, the Russian Social Democratic Party and the SPD. And sometimes people take, the line that that Lenin discovers a party of a new type or something, and that's his fundamental innovation. Um, I tend to think there's something different going on in, say, like the dynamics internal to the SPD. I don't know if they would just say like reject that outright. Um, they bring up elite theory, which, just a question for you. I wonder if that is like, does that refer to what it does today with like Robert Michels and like the political parties thing, where he's like studying the internal dynamics of sort of opportunism, bureaucratization, what he calls like the internal oligarchy of the SPD in 1911, that sort of thing. Because then that would bear on this question.
Mhm.
Someone had a hand though.
Hello, sorry. Hi, thank you, James, for a good introduction and translating the work. Well, it was a similar kind of thought to what you were saying just then, Andy, actually. It was about what is the difference between, let's say, a mass party and a proletarian party? Because I didn't take it necessarily that, at least in this context, it was necessarily a vanguard party. I mean, wouldn't it be the case that, let's say, just a proletarian party would be a particularization, which would be self-abolishing? And maybe that kind of introduces the question of what's the difference. Obviously Adorno has a lot of critiques of the term mass itself, and what's the difference between a mass party or the word mass and a proletarian party, which could be or but not necessarily be a vanguard party.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And this is so in the notes that they generate for authoritarian state, they seem to combining that with sort of the criticism of the popular front approach of the religious socialists at the beginning here, where he says he like dunks on the inclusion of the heterogeneous at one point, which is not something you necessarily think that Adorno is going to dunk on. But his point is that there's sort of the pretense to, like, again, this sort of pre-existing unity rather than one that's formed. And it's with, in this case, common cause with conservatives and reactionaries that Adorno has a problem too with religious socialism in particular. But I think that for them, the mass party is the problem of, it has to do with the problem of political apathy that they'll talk about in the authoritarian state essay, which is when everyone is sort of like by birth a member of the party already, by merit of living in a certain country where the party becomes identifiable with, like a national power block. So mass party in that sense is sort of like the assumption of a party character that belongs to sort of the mass as it currently exists, just by merit of existing. So that means it does not involve mobilization. It does not involve politicization, both of which they seem to think are essential for this. And so that would be the problematic character of the mass party. They tend to think of, whenever anyone speaks of the masses, and this is interesting, it's their critique of mass psychology, whether it's Laban or it's Freud. If anyone uses the category of the masses uncritically, they're referring to the masses as an object of social administration. And they think that this is true, unfortunately, for certain mass parties in their development, which they call the reactionary development of the mass parties. So that seems to be it. The vanguard isn't, like numerically restricted in that sense. And even in the notes, they'll say, the revolution is not going to be undertaken by the mass party, but by everyone. And that's how they follow that up, which means, this would probably look like to many people what they would call a mass uprising. But for them, they really want to push against the use of that category of masses, especially in terms of referring to a given pre-existing unity, which would be like, because you're born in a certain country, you belong to the Communist Party. That seems to be what they're opposed to, rather than, I mean, it would be interesting here to also go through in the beginning section, which would probably help us clarify this. Like, what's wrong with like the party being a movement or a popular front or something like that? Because it seems like it's defined in the negative there, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to sort of bring out the vanguardist element, because that's going to appear in several of their other pieces, but it's mostly in that sort of negative list of the problem with the party today is it's too much like a movement. It's too much like a vibe. It's too much like a mass political base, for any other politics, and it's not enough like the kind of unique thing the party was for what they take to be the radical edge of the Marxist tradition. So like that's the other thing, which is like what is unique about the party as they see it within the tradition of revolutionary Marxism of Marx, Luxemburg, Lenin. So yeah, I guess I would say the movement in service of the Popular Front, potentially. Because when he's talking about here, so there's on page 20, I think, of the interesting, Andy, on the point with Krakauer, because they will also flag that they need to distinguish their position from Krakauer's in some of the 1940 notes. And I had no idea what that was a reference to. So that's probably that. But yeah, so like the Marxist Party, where they'll say here, and this is where they have the problem with, what is it, the false appeal to the immediacy of the folk, when this is itself a highly mediated condition of subjects in late capitalist society, and the fascists or the reactionaries appeal to the folk as if it's something existing. So they're going to make this similar gesture again and again. But yeah, I guess I would just ask then in response, what's the problem with a movement? Why can't the party be a movement? And how does it differ in that sense from other like kinds of mass organizations or appeals to like collective and communal spirit? Because that seems to be the place where they're really pushing against.
What's up? Hey everyone. Yeah, I mean, just to that question, it's interesting that they're very specific in a way that like any part, this is like on the bottom of page 20-ish. Any party that calls itself a movement because it wants nothing to do with the reification of concrete programs is therefore not more but less than a party. So it does feel like uh there's something in being programmatic, which I think does mean asserting a certain particularity, right? Even a certain like maybe, I don't know. I feel like uh maybe I'm a little more Hegelian than Adorno, but like or like the Hegelian language a little more, but like a singularity even, like in the like concrete program, like that's like yeah, that that's some of the content that we're talking about. I mean, it's like interesting because like a program, it feels like you could consider it in multiple ways. You can consider it as like a I don't know, a crystallization of like kind of like the work and politicization and struggle and like all of this stuff that has gone into like the formation of a party, or you can think of it as like something that's written and embodies ideas that are singular in a sense or particular in some sense, or I mean, I tend to think of it more as like something that I don't know, in this sense feels like it has a mass character if we take mass to mean like democratic, but like, like kind of the yeah, like democratic will of a body, like that kind of like brings it together.
My question then would be, what makes a movement not a particular um, in this way? Like, why is this category of particularity, or um, maybe I'm a little bit wary of wanting to say that that's interchangeable with singularity, I suppose. But even so, in how you're thinking of the singularity, Mac, is there a what how how do you read that as differentiating the movement and the party then? Um,
I mean, a program has to differentiate itself from things, whereas a movement uh doesn't necessarily differentiate itself, and that it doesn't come to that kind of like clarity, right? Like it doesn't involve a um I don't know, and this is why I think maybe the singular, because like the particular would be just a differentiation like against other kind of like parties or something like that, whereas the singular feels like, it's more of like there's a process of like self negation and development that like develops this document, like there's an internal conflict and there's internal kind of contradiction within the thing that actually like produces like a program.
Yeah, the question of, I think, internal conflicts and how those are handled is important, because I think one of the things they object to in the form of like the newer mass party, which is sort of like everyone's automatically enrolled by virtue of being born kind of thing, um, is going to be that uh, this sort of covers over conflicts and contradictions in the party rather than resolving them. And so I think that like maybe this has to do with, like, and I pointed out Adorno's critique of Tillich's critique of democracy, which I think is interesting, uh, where he's going to say, and this is towards the very end. It's in the last section. It is, yeah, it's on page 39 to 40, where he's going to say that democratic procedures are the results of historical conflicts. And he says that this is, being misrecognized here. You criticize democratic procedures, call them an attempt to institutionalize the genuine demand for political determination implied in man's essential freedom. And then he makes fun of, who was the subject of this attempt. Is it, the Weltgeist? But this is also where he's going to say that there's sort of a misunderstanding in his critique of democracy and democratic equality here, because he fails to understand democratic forms as the result of these forms of conflict, and he's going to fail to see sort of where they're supposed to end up, like a possible structure of mediation, it seems like, and this is what the party would otherwise be able to provide. And this he gets at the next paragraph, which is on page 41. I think it's page 41. Which is about the critique of equality, where he says, you have a critique of equality, which he then says, your critique of equality, if you really want to get a sense for it, go to the southern United States, which is referring to segregation, which is pretty brutal. But he's going to say also, and this is where he's going to, I think, refer to Lenin. Yeah, and this is on page 41. And he'll say, socialism wants not to extend this, the idea of, chances, everyone has an equal chance, but not guaranteed equal outcome. He says, socialism wants not to extend this without measure, but abolish it altogether. But first, of course, this would require that, as a non-religious socialist wrote in a now unpopular text, the remaining functions of state could be overseen by a cleaning lady, or this is effectively any cook can govern, right? So it does seem like the party would play an important role for mediation of disputes that are recognized as such, rather than papered over by appeals to the pre-existing and illusory harmony of the people with whom the party is concerned. So again, I don't know if that's an answer to the question as much as an extension of the problem.
Definitely worth flagging also that it's fascinating that in that section that we're looking at, 40 to 41, because there's this, again, this is something that I've been bringing up a few times, but there's a general maybe reading of Adorno as having a kind of abstract opposition to like the conceptual operation of identity or of equality. Um, and I think it's interesting here that he, against what he regards as Tillich's actually abstract or indeterminate version of an opposition to equality and democracy, he brings up the necessity of formal democratic equality as a demand in the U.S. South, as this sort of urgent problem, and he brings up Lenin as saying that. He says on 41, he says, said materially, our critique of the equality ideal refers itself to a condition of abundance in which it would be repressive to count the number of beefsteaks someone eats because everyone can eat as many as they like, while in such a condition, others might very well disdain to eat any more meat at all. So long this point has not yet been reached, the vulgar materialistic phraseology of sharing holds true. Instead of this, the demand for equal opportunity reduces socialism to the abolition of school fees and increasing the estate tax, which monopolies would be quite comfortable with. Um, so again, it's this idea that like too quick a a opposition to this idea that there is a kind of particularistic um, bourgeois right to be realized in the dictatorship of the proletariat too quickly, just saying, oh, let's just fix all this stuff by a kind of state administered recognition of differences, right? The inclusion of the heterogeneous in contravention of the interests of the particular. Um, this results in, right, a socialism that just means, you know, a ballot measure to lower school fees, and to increase the estate tax, right? Um, I think this is a very interesting sort of way to politically configure, right? What Adorno actually, and maybe this gets to the before and after thing, because he seems to think of his opposition to identity thinking, even though he kind of masks this in negative dialectics, I think, or it's hard to see it. He said he does say it, but people don't read that as him saying, well, it's kind of a before and after problem with the identity thinking thing. Like it's not simply to be, the inclusion of the heterogeneous is not simply to be advocated right now because that's politics, like he says to Tillich. Like that just takes the politics as a realm that manages this inclusion of the heterogeneous, whereas the particular can take the political as its object to be overcome. Um, Zachary, if you're able to, um, you could elaborate on your bringing in the question of artwork with respect to exchange principle, et cetera. That might also follow from this question of exchange and identity and things like that.
What was I thinking? Yeah. Uh, yeah, I mean, well, the passage you brought up, I mean, it would be helpful, I think, for us to piece together what it means to oppose universality, what the principle of universality is in capitalist society for Adorno. I mean, the passage you brought up is great because there he's talking about like the principle of equivalent exchange. Um, what is that? Yeah. So, I mean, the problem is, right, with equivalent exchange is that it's realized in inequality. I mean, it's more than that. I mean, we get this spell where like the productive forces are advanced enough to feed everyone on the planet, and yet material privation, continues. Uh, yeah. So the question is, I mean that makes things more complicated. But anyway, the question is like, what does it mean to oppose the exchange principle or the principle of equivalent exchange? And yeah, obviously like the monadological artwork is a kind of model, and he says as much in various places that it's supposed to be, his work on art in general, but modernism in particular is supposed to provide a kind of archetype for praxis or whatever. But anyway, that brings me to I'm just rambling because I don't know exactly what I was thinking when I wrote that, Andy, and how to respond to your question. But thinking back, Chris last time said Adorno's not a Marxist, but a modernist. And then, I heard you say something, I heard you more or less side with the Marxist side earlier, or at least you said that this clarifies that there's a valid claim to be made, other than Chris's. And it brings up the question of the relationship between modernism and Marxism and what's going on here. And so, like, one thing modernism is a kind of like self-critical nominalism, which is just, and now we're like, now we're back in the dealing with the question of particularity versus universality, right? I mean, so I guess, I'm sorry, I'm just rambling because I'm thinking out loud. But thinking about Jake's thing again about like this. If this is anti-totality politics, maybe it's outlived its utility or whatever, or it's become an impediment to solidarity, I think Jake said. So I guess then a question we would or that sort of invites us to consider all of this stuff is like, what would a self-critical nominalism be that's adequate to this moment? Like, okay, if modernism is not, if Adorno's nominalism is not just like an aesthetic thing, like he's a Marxist, let's say, and this helps us to see that, like, what's going on, when he's making these claims about that universality can only be expressed in extreme particularity or whatever. Yeah, does that make sense? This is just another question, I guess. So what is this? If modernism is dead, let's say, and but is there something here for us still? Is there something about like a self-critical nominalism that that maybe is not an impediment to solidarity? And what would that be?
Yeah, I think that the art question is a very interesting one. But unless someone has a direct response on the art question, I think we have to address our stack that has grown in the chat. Okay, seems like no takers. So Jay, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'm going to give my take on the particularity thing and then throw a bomb in. And I'll stick around for a little bit, and then I have to go make dinner. So the particularity thing, I think the particularity is probably the right language for his thing to do, the whole particularity movement thing. Reading through that section again, the issue with the movement thing is like, I mean, it's sort of the classic sort of liquidation question, liquidationism, of course, in the original Russian party that was about liquidating the underground thing, but later on it became a more pressing thing. Like, I mean, a couple of years after this was written, fuckface, what was his name? Browder would dissolve the entire Communist Party and turn it into a lobbying group for the Democrats in America. But the idea of saying this is not a party, this is a movement, is giving up on the particularity that the party possesses. And as a reference here, whenever a group denies its particular character and pretends to be blah, 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 it falls prey to the same particularism it claims to have abolished. So first of all, disavowing your own particularity doesn't work. That's point one. Second point is that the particularity is good. It's necessary, right? And I think a statement he makes later here is very clarifying on this, which is the connection between particularity and finitude. I think it would be correct to say that Adorno, and this is also true of Horkheimer, something else that Crane has translated, a aphorism from Horkheimer from the either late 20s or early 30s, where he talks about this in relationship to revolution, called German title is a Metaphysische Verklärung der Revolution, metaphysical transfiguration of the revolution. The finite ideal of socialism, which is this connected to this thing about the beefsteaks. Oh, socialism is just everyone has enough to eat, whatever. This kind of classic sort of deflationary thing that Adorno does as a rhetorical move. But on page 37, start of this paragraph on page 37, he says this: whenever the concern for the soul takes over from politics, the sacrifice of life is trivialized. The sacrifice dies not for infinite meaning, but finite goal. Socialism is a finite goal. Revolution is a finite goal. So the aim is finite. The aim is not infinite. So this sort of disavowal of particularity and of finitude is also inappropriate in that sense. There is no sort of infinite task or oceanic feeling that's going on here. It's a quite simple, finite thing. And in that sense, the remark about the program also, I think, falls into line there, because in a certain sense, Adorno is saying very straightforwardly, yes, it is particular, it is a program, it is a limited, it is a finite thing. So I think that's the reading on the whole particularism, finitude, movement, program nexus of concepts, is that I think it is the most straightforward possible interpretation. But it does contrast a little bit with this, because the stereotype is sort of that Adorno or whatever, these people, Marcuse, have an idea of, oh, well, socialism is when we'll be able to talk to plants and everything will be super fun all the time. You'll never have to do any work and everything is perfect. And that's why it'll never happen, right? When in reality, of course, Adorno loves making this rhetorical move of saying, no, utopia is everyone gets a burger or whatever. So that's my take on that. Now, the grenade or whatever that I want to throw is a question, putting it back to the political thing, and this is quite similar to the kind of question that I asked last time, is like, why care so much about what Adorno has to say about politics and parties and stuff, considering, there's a little bit of a pot and kettle moment here when he says to speak as a socialist and at the same time claim to know nothing of parties would mean falling behind this insight. And here's practically the only text where he talks about this, and he didn't publish it. A little bit of physician heal thyself going on here. Why take him seriously about this stuff when, you could go classic Habermas, performative contradiction. He says something, he says one thing and does another. But what is the purpose of this that doesn't just fall into, reading tea leaves, into trying to find his, how many fucking Soviets can dance on the head of Adorno's pin or whatever. What is the ideal sort of upshot of what we would get from this? Is it unifying Adorno's other work, his work on art, his work on whatever, history, etc., with a more complete and true and correct idea of politics? Is that what we're looking for here? Probably, I would say that. Or idea of the reverse, of we can learn something for politics from this, instead of just confirming our pre-existing ideas.
Brilliant. I am very tempted to respond, but I'm respecting the stack. Anatara.
All right. Hello, everybody. Am I audible? Okay. Let James respond to JE later. My question is quite simple, which is, where is science for Adorno? The Marx and Engels have a name for their project. It's called scientific socialism. And to them, science kind of is like this secret, not secret, it's just their explicit word to kind of beat ideology, do everything correctly, reach solidarity. It's like an actual product of the human species, for both Marx and Engels. And when I was reading this, I see a lot of resonances with the young Marx, right? With man being now a thing that we can realize with capitalism, despite its destructive capabilities, which I see Adorno kind of repeating in this text. So this is kind of my way to think about the question of the program and the other things, which is to say, uh, for Marx, it's easy. The program, living and failing, that's just kind of the task of doing science, right? The idea is to have global solidarity. The idea is to fail, particularly for the community of essentially other communists, the most advanced parts of the working class, right? That have no nation, as the Communist Manifesto tells us, to learn, right? There is a memory, there is something, there's political work, scientific work, all types of work that if you take this identity, you do, and that the aim is to realize like natural history. So it's like I was shocked for him to like talk openly about the party, but I was more shocked that there's no, like a concrete, um, it's like the flex that Marxists can do to the liberals. Like you have no strategy, you have no tactics, you have no swag, you know, stuff like this. So that's kind of my question, which is like, what would bringing this question tell us about Adorno, right? That's kind of my thing, because I can't have a research program, as like Lakatos tells me, without like a hardcore, right? I need to have my things that I'm not letting go. So that's my question.
Maybe James should respond before me so I don't keep adding to the pile before we uh, address things.
Oh, Jake, I want to hear from you actually. And then uh yeah, then we can all try to tackle what I think have been great questions, which is this physician heal thyself? Uh and what about science? Both of which I think, and especially the natural sciences, which I do think are very important here. So yeah. Yeah, Jake, what do you got?
I guess it is kind of related to the topic of method like what we're doing here. Do we take him seriously? Just to invoke a little bit of this like comparative like Jewish intellectual history that is informing my dissertation. Like in when the Hitler-Stalin Pact is signed in 41, like a lot of these New York intellectuals, some of whom the are Adorno and Horkheimer are in discussion with, like turn on a dime and become very like pro-America, contra fascism, and embrace Popular Front. So this is a really interesting historical document because it shows the reticence of Adorno and Horkheimer, I think, to do that as feeling so because they feel so dislocated in the US and they have such a strong critique of capitalism as like the dominant authoritarian party and any resonance or any identity that it shares with fascism and socialism, it takes a kind of primary role in that informing that identity. And so then you have, it seems like part of what I think we're doing here, in my eyes, is to like think about this as a kind this highly contradictory, like still communist period in the US as like as them grappling in contradictory ways with this kind of political problem where they don't they're not satisfied with anything and so they keep going to um, a party that supports war against Germany, but is not like Stalin, I guess. And I mean, that really seems like what they're after or something. I don't know that I don't see here like a real um, like council communist reading available. Um, yeah, and so that to say then like what do we do with that kind of contradictory wrestling and like the fact that they become much more reactionary when they move back to Germany? To me, those are kind of historical questions or questions for intellectual history, rather than like seeing the unity of their thought shine through. Yeah.
Okay, James, solve all the problems.
Okay, yeah. Um, okay. First, taking them in order. First, what are we expecting to learn from Adorno on this? Is this a physician heal thyself moment kind of thing? First, yes, it is a physician heal thyself kind of thing. That is, I think, and it's very interesting that Adorno, for instance, is even in the letter that he writes to Horkheimer, where he was like, of course, our use of the before and after mode is different than what Tillich's is. And it is, I mean, it is different, but it's still there. And so he refers to, there's the two sections where he says, uh, the draft itself makes occasional use of the before and after form, which of course means something different in this context. And so when he criticizes Tillich's, it's that he says, it is not that one can finally contemplate the human being in the future once peace and harmony reign. Rather, the contemplative question of the essence of the human being in itself is to deny that very essence. The theory of class society must rid itself of the whole logic of that before and after. The epitome of the common sense view of time or remains traditionalist in the first sense. He'll also get there to the discussion of the two-phase theory and Marx's critique of utopia, which I think is interesting. He'll say Marx goes after utopia strongly, perhaps more than he ought to have. That was good for him too. But he'll say maybe it's just, and this is his, at the very least, the before and after mode of thinking of certain Marxists, at least the interval in between is not quite so long as the incarnation of Christ and the parousia, or the second coming, which roughly corresponds to all of human time. So yeah, maybe it is, just a difference like that, which is the rejection of sort of the religious socialist approach here. But yes, they retain the form. And this is in the, Adorno will himself say, in the section on equality specifically, which is that when they criticize equality, they are doing it from something like a recognition of the possibility of a more substantial form of equality than sort of the parody of equality that they find at work in like the formal democratic universalism of the present. And so what they contrast to, the pseudo equality of today, which is the equality of conformism that reinforces differences between people materially anyway, even if it formally might recognize their equal opportunities to achieve certain things or their equal chances. They oppose to that the any cook can govern quote from Lenin. So they are also invoking, and I think this gets at, the question that we sort of started off with, that Zach raised in response to Jake's points last week, which is that they do seem to have moments where they think that, and they wouldn't use the language of prefiguration, but I think, as Adorno himself says, in contrast to Tillich at one point, there are certain things about the individual today, which even if the form of the individual as it exists, as a resistance to the collective, is, overly stained by it and will obviously have to go, there's still something in that kind of resistance that points towards a better future. And it is interesting. I do think these moments come up here. So yes, it is a case of physician heal thyself by Adorno. But I don't think that for that reason it is, first of all, I don't think Adorno didn't see that. And I don't think that disqualifies it as a piece. In fact, I think it makes it stronger as sort of Adorno's wrestling of what to do in the position, as he says, how not to sacrifice thinking when you have been reduced to political powerlessness, which is what he uses to describe his entire 1940s work, is the attempt not to sacrifice thinking despite political powerlessness. And this seems to be an attempt to do that. So that's the first question. Yes, it is physician heal thyself, but that's what makes it important. Second question is about the character of science. This, I think, has to go back to the section on Nietzsche, and where there's the dispute over the characterization of the human being, where he's going to go after several different types of reductionism, and he's going to claim that Tillich's position is also going to be reductionist because it has to deny the biological character of the human being, rather than recognizing that. And so like this, I think, is probably the place I would look for that in particular, is the disputes over philosophical anthropology, more so than in the sections on party in the program. And to Jake's, and I think correct response, which is it is fascinating from the intellectual historical standpoint of how, for instance, they did think, here's the crazy thing to that response. So for those listening, J.E. Morin says, I think it would be stronger if he founded an anti-revisionist groupuscule or something after this versus him feeling bad about not doing anything. They think they do have an anti-revisionist groupuscule. That's what they think they're doing in exile, even in the United States. And they think about that like through the late 40s, even with its shrinking numbers. They think of themselves, and this is another thing I wanted to push and possibly provoke people. They think of themselves as a scientific avant-garde that's supposed to be in parallel to something like a political one, and they're looking for a political one. And they don't find it, or maybe they don't look hard enough or far enough, but they do think of themselves in those terms, even if they're wrong. But to Jake's question, I would say what I think is interesting is if we're gonna, self-contextualize in a certain sense, also when we do the historicist gesture, it would be to say something like, to ask, are we in that much of a better position than Adorno was when he was writing this? It's possible he was in a worse one, better in some ways, worse in others. But I think that's also where the question comes up. And I think that there's also something here where it's like, if they really did fail to found like an anti-revisionist groupuscule or something in exile, although again, they did think that's what they were doing throughout the 40s. If they did fail, then I think that failure tells us something instructive too, which is that it's not enough to have like a small groupuscule of anti-revisionists and expect that in some sense maintaining, the flame, keeping the flame burning of the invariant program of the Communist Party or whatever, that wasn't enough for them. And I think that tells us something also. So maybe it's, what it tells us is not a programmatic thing to take from it. But it's that not even their intransigent, or as they'll use the term, unswerving effort at the time was enough.
Jake?
Yeah, it's so funny that you say that, James, because I was thinking about whether or not I should say that the what they're calling for here in the concept of a non-vanguard party sounds like what Horkheimer was saying intellectuals should behave like in 37 in in traditional and critical theory. And so then, and I do think that that's more of a method, like that's actually kind of a deeper problem where then that puts them in a position of like chastising imperfect political forms, um, in particularly like when in third worldism and like in they're saying yeah me and who, and it's like they're watching the left formations of the world that are not perfect like pass them by because they know better, and in that like begins what I think is their revisionist turn. Yeah.
Maybe this will end up being maybe an oppositional take to Jake's, but this is more immediately inspired by the heal thyself problem, which I don't think is necessarily not a problem. Like, would I prefer that Adorno, when he grew up, became the next Lenin that was capable of solving the problem in the 40s? Yes, I do. Um, but I guess it maybe also gets back to the question of why is the particularity of the party. Like, to me, this reminds me of, say, like language of like the Lukács standpoint essay, um or even going further back to say like Luxembourg is sort of invoked here, and the revisionist controversy where Luxembourg is like, he of course doesn't say you split with the opportunists, or the forces that tend towards opportunism in the party, the particular interests of the particular trade unions, say, the trade union consciousness. But she says you kind of build up, or like as those increase in scale and need to have a sort of like understanding of the situation to pursue their particular interests as proletarians at a certain scale. Eventually, the highest scale would be the proletariat as a whole. And for that particular, to pursue the particular interests of the proletariat as a whole requires expropriating capital, destroying the state, dictatorship of the proletariat, and things like that. And so I think there's this constant sort of weird dynamic, and it's not exclusive to Adorno and Horkheimer, but it's the question of like that can't just be immediately abstractly recommended. It has to arise as something that is like adequate to the problems of the organizations at a certain scale and a certain amount of radicalism. And I think, that's the irony of the Gothic critique that keeps emerging for Adorno is, of course, the Gothic critique too was unsent and failed to prevent the merger that it was writing against, and only became public in 1892 when Engels used it to oppose the Erfurt program. And so there's, and similarly, you can think of Marx when he first starts the First International, writing those letters to Engels, where he's like, we can't talk like we did in the Communist Manifesto yet, but one day, once this really gets off the ground, then we can say what we really think. But for now, we have to kind of talk more like, meat and potatoes British trade unionists. And so I think this kind of gets the whole, the later towards a new manifesto that Adorno and Horkheimer write as well, where they're kind of like, well, there's no one to listen to this. There's not really a point to say this, or it's not like practically actionable at the level of proletarian organization right now. So what would even be the point of saying this? Well, I don't know. That is the question. Like, should Marx have publicly circulated the Goth critique and tried more forcefully to stop the merger? That's, I feel like, an analogous question. Obviously, enormous differences, but James, would you like maybe last word? We did a little bit better in not going over this time, but.
Oh, I would just say that I think it's a shame that the Towards a New Manifesto that everyone knows is that of the 55-56 conversations. That is actually basically when that project's already dead. There's no chance of Horkheimer working with Adorno on it, which is also why he's kind of egging him on in the process. But it's also a later version of the discussions that they have that are much more interesting in 39, I think, where they sketch out multiple different possible versions of the new manifesto, which I'm not saying that it's any cleaner at all or any more of a solution, but it is interesting to try to see, because they don't think that there's necessarily an addressee at any one point, even of like their most, outspoken, well, at least in their private drafts, outspokenly, like revolutionary period, which I think, and it's very interesting that some of their most explicitly revolutionary statements will come in the mid 40s, right? Like this is 44. The next one on the relationship between critical intellectuals and the party is going to be in 46. This is like the last time I expected to come across anything from them that was most explicit about like fidelity to the revolutionary project in a pretty classical sense. But yeah, so that's what I would say, is that I think it is interesting that they also struggled for this. Makes the manifesto project another one of their unfinished projects that they would then have worked on, if we say 55 is when it definitely became impossible, for like more than 15 years previously. And they were not able to deliver on it then. But again, I think in this sense, reading this as something that's incomplete, Contra Paulum, what it does as sort of, and I think this is something that they'll say constantly, even as they have to self-censor aggressively in the United States over the 40s, when they think they're being, like this anti-revisionist groupuscule effectively. And then they have to like just butcher every draft they do. They have like 10 different versions. They always start in German and then they keep going into English. But he's going to say that they have to do these things for our morals or for our conscience, because this is also part of the other side of the problem of there being no addressee for this stuff that they know, which is part of where I guess the message in a bottle, who is it supposed to go to? This is the imaginary witness at the very end of, the Notes and Sketches and Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is that I would say it's that for them, the earnest search for an addressee who could pick this stuff up, recognize it for being Marxist, That's going to be tough with dialectic of enlightenment since they tend to cut out every single reference that's too explicit. But who is the imaginary witness? And I think that whether or not they were able to recognize any political movement after like 1950 as being a potential addressee, I don't think that means we can't read ourselves as those addressees because we're able to recognize this. And so I think that part of their message of despair and why it's a message of hope is because if you're reading this, it's not too late kind of thing would be the message that they attach here, which is that if you're reading this and you can understand, and I think that's kind of what Contra Paulum can function as, even though it remained unsent and was mostly just, Contra Drake. But it was even just, like their way of demarcating their position, almost like affirming themselves. At least we're not like Tillich, which is what it could be read as. So I think that that's really what this is for. And so I don't think that that means taking up their position as programmatic, although it is, again, it would be fascinating to track what they think the programmatic steps are, which come up in the 46 fragment and are wild. But yeah, so that's all I got, which is we are the imaginary witnesses. And that means that there's a hell of a lot of responsibility that has been placed on our shoulders if we're the ones who are supposed to be the recipients there. In a world that has many of the same problems, also worse problems. So yeah. I mean, talk about that perennial repression. It's fucking kicking our asses.
Beautiful.
So that's all I got. Yeah.
I think very, very well done. Very, very good ending note. All right. I'll see you all, I think, in a little over 2 weeks for Chris O'Kane's fourth and final session of the series. But an enormous thank you to James for being our guide for 2 out of 4 of the sessions. But yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Cheers. Thank you.